Among countless notable achievements in exploration, 5 firsts achieved by our members define the legacy of the Explorers Club. 1909, the North Pole. 1911, the South Pole. 1953, the highest point on Earth, summiting Mount Everest. 1960, the lowest point on Earth, the Marianas Trench. 1969, the surface of the Moon, the Apollo 11 mission. The club's founding mission, to promote exploration by all means possible, remains our driving force. Headquartered in New York City with a community of chapters around the world, the Explorers Club supports scientific expeditions of all disciplines and unites our members in the bonds of good fellowship. Historic flags are carried on our most distinguished expeditions. Our members are storytellers and changemakers. We are driven by the instinct to explore, forge new frontiers, and push boundaries for the scientific advancement of human knowledge. We are explorers. Together, Fjällräven and the Explorers Club inspire the world to walk with nature. Join us each month for a thought-provoking and exciting new episode featuring explorers from around the world as they share their work and stories from the field. Our goal is to push the boundaries of curiosity, explore the wild around us, and inspire new and seasoned explorers to discover nature in a new way. The sense of togetherness with nature has never been more crucial. This is the Explorers Club Fjällräven Speaker Series.
Hi everyone, my name is John E. Marriott and I'm a professional wildlife photographer based in Canmore, Alberta, Canada. I'm an associate fellow with the International League of Conservation Photographers. I am the co-founder of the EXPOSED Wildlife Conservancy. I'm a Canon Ambassador, and I'm also a Fjällraven guide.
Hello, my name is Tori Linder. I'm an American conservationist and storyteller based in Miami, Florida. I work at the intersection of communications and policy to amplify environmental and sustainable development efforts. Currently, I serve as the managing director and impact producer of the Path of the Panther project. John, it's a pleasure to be with you today. Can you tell us a little bit about what led you on your path of exploration or conservation?
Hey, Tori. Yes, it's great to be with you today, too. My path to conservation, and it led through photography. I started out as a little kid being just fascinated with wildlife, and I kind of lost the path through my teens and into my early 20s. I went to university on a golf and math scholarship, so about as far from conservation and the wildlife photography realm as you could possibly get. And in second year university, sort of saw the light. I ended up switching into forestry and doing a Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Management that included a year and a half at the University of California, Berkeley, where I learned from some of the best wildlife professors in the world. And it led to a job with Parks Canada in Banff National Park, which is Canada's flagship national park. It's the 3rd national park created in the world. And in that job, I was fortunate enough to have a number of coworkers that were really avid nature photographers. And that got me really going into photography. And very quickly, I transitioned out of Parks Canada into starting my own business as a wildlife photographer. And within about 10 years of that, of becoming a full-time wildlife photographer, I really started to get very heavily into the world of conservation. I want to tell you a story about a grizzly bear called Field. So when I first started off with Parks Canada, I had just moved to Banff. I was living in the hostel. I had met a couple of friends, and I had never seen a grizzly bear at that point. And so one evening I was down at the Parks Visitor Center and I saw this bulletin go up on the bulletin board, and it said there's this grizzly bear warning out between Banff and Lake Louise. And so I rushed back to the hostel, grabbed a couple of friends, loaded up on my little Honda Civic, and drove out down the Bow Valley Parkway, this quiet road. And we saw this grizzly bear called Field. And I remember just being so awed, getting to watch her for a couple of hours on the side of the road eating dandelions. Well, within a week of that, Field walked into a campground, got into a cooler full of food, and was captured by Parks Canada and moved out of the park. She immediately came back into the park, got into trouble with humans again, was captured again, and this time moved to northern Alberta, almost 700 kilometers, 400 miles north of Banff. And within a week, she got into an oil and gas trailer and was shot and killed by Fish and Wildlife officers. And that, I just remember it being so distinct in my mind, thinking, oh my gosh, like the first grizzly bear I've ever seen, and she is already dead, and it's because of humans. And that was really a turning point in my life, both in my career with Parks Canada and then later as I got into photography very heavily. And that's what really led me into the world of conservation. So Tori, I would love to know what led to your path of exploration and conservation.
I like to say that I'm a humanitarian turned conservationist. I actually studied political science and sustainable development in university. That led me to the small Central East African country of Rwanda, where I was working on an economic development project in a rural village. Pretty quickly through this process, I came to realize that a healthy environment underpins everything. So many of our efforts were being tampered by basic lack of access to water. Rwanda is the most heavily populated nation on the continent of Africa. It's also one of the most deforested. And seeing firsthand the impacts of that collapse of a watershed was really eye-opening to me, and launched my interest in pursuit in conservation. John, if I may ask you another question, data can capture minds, but art and storytelling can really capture hearts for our natural world. What makes a conservation photographer unique from a traditional wildlife photographer?
I think, as when I started out, I was a pretty traditional wildlife photographer. And that means I would just go out and I would get the shot. And it might just be a pretty animal, not necessarily doing much. And my photography has really evolved as I've gotten more into conservation. And there's a few things that really separate it from being a traditional wildlife photographer. Instead of just getting the shot now, you're really trying to tell a story. You're trying to connect people to that animal. And sometimes it's by showing something that can be shocking, a train coming along towards a grizzly bear and people knowing that trains are the #1 killer here in Banff of grizzly bears inside the national park. Or it can be just a beautiful picture of an animal with a story that I tell to go with it. It might be a cougar that I stalked through the woods and was able to have a close encounter with, a puma, as you guys call them down there in Florida. So it can be a number of different things. And it's just, as a conservation photographer, I really want to increase appreciation for animals. I want people to feel emotionally connected to them. And that's where art and storytelling really separates you from a traditional wildlife photographer that's just out there kind of documenting what's going on. So Tori, I did want to ask, you actually started your career in sub-Saharan Africa and then have moved home to the state of Florida. And I want to know what inspired that change.
As I mentioned earlier, I worked in Rwanda during university. I then later spent time working for Conservation International in both Kenya and South Africa, primarily focused on how we restore the Great Plains. It was an absolutely captivating experience, a dream job in so many capacities. But what happened to me was that every time I got on a flight home, whether it be for Thanksgiving or Christmas, I would look out the window of the plane and see another corner of my own backyard missing. Around that time, my now colleague, then mentor, Carlton Ward Jr., shared a really staggering statistic with me. At that moment, Florida was developing at a rate of 20 acres an hour, making my home, the Greater Everglades ecosystem, just as endangered as anything we were looking at in the Mara. And that became a massive turning point in my personal life and career that ultimately inspired me to move back to Florida and join the Path of the Panther project. Personally, my family has been in agriculture in the state of Florida for 5 generations. And over my lifetime, I've watched green pastures turn to gray development. Our connected environment has suffered an enormous loss in that process. But it's not just habitats that have been fragmented, it's supply chains too. And that's been a really fascinating learning in my time here, is the interconnected nature of our wildlife and people.
So Tori, you mentioned their Path of the Panther, and I'm sure I'm not alone in wanting to know what that is. It sounds really interesting. And what is it working to do? What is this project, Path of the Panther?
Path of the Panther is a conservation storytelling project that's worked to tell the story of the Florida Panther and the land it needs to survive, the Florida Wildlife Corridor. The Florida Panther has an incredible story. In a time when big cats across the globe are in decline, it's making a remarkable recovery. From just under 30 individuals in the 1970s, we have over 200 panthers in Southwest Florida today. But to continue their recovery, they require a connected network of lands across our state. So we're advocating for the protection of the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which is a statewide network of private and public lands spanning nearly 18 million acres from Florida Bay in the far south to the Georgia and Alabama borders. John, in 2021, to a certain degree, I think we all consider ourselves amateur photographers, thanks to the smartphones we carry around. But I have to say, there's a huge difference between one of your images and one of mine. Can you share with us a little bit about what goes into getting the shot? Your work is so captivating.
I actually had a pretty remarkable experience this past winter that really defines what I sometimes have to do to get the shot. And it was a 1-month project that I did from January 1st to January 31st. My wife and son were away, and so I took advantage, and every single day from dawn or even pre-dawn till post-dusk, I went out and I tracked cougars or pumas in the snow right near my home here. I'm very fortunate enough to live on the edge of Banff National Park, and we have cougars and wolves and grizzly bears right on the edge of my town, even walking into town sometimes. And so I went out every day and tracked cougars, trying to get photographs of them, sometimes snowshoeing and hiking with spikes on the bottom of my boots to be able to walk on the ice and snow up to 25 kilometers in a day, so about 15 miles in a day, with temperatures ranging as low as minus 40 degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit. So it was, very, very harsh conditions, often very windy. For the first 8 days, I didn't even find a fresh track. So it was extremely demoralizing at times. But halfway through my project on day 13, I actually encountered a female mountain lion and her kitten, and was able to spend 2 days with them. And it was one of the most remarkable experiences of my life. And it made all of the hard work that I had put in the 2 weeks prior so very worth it.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah. So Tori, I'm interested to know, I went out and I was able to find cougars here. What about down there? The panther is exceptionally rare in Florida, but you're working with them. Have you actually seen one in the wild?
The panther is extraordinarily rare. What also makes it a little bit more challenging to see the Florida panther is that it calls the Florida Everglades home, which is a really dense environment. So interestingly enough, our team has had to work to capture photos and videos of the panther, not in person with a camera, but rather utilizing DSLR camera trap studios. So essentially, camera trap systems, pardon me. So essentially, what my colleague Malia Burtis and Carlton Ward Jr. do are set up entire professional photo studios in the woods and allow panthers to take their own selfie. That's provided a never before seen glimpse into the world of the Florida panther and so many other species dependent on their habitat, such as the Florida black bear or the American alligator. Interestingly enough, for the thousands of hours I've spent in the swamps of South Florida, I've only ever seen a panther in the wild once. And comically, I had forgotten my glasses that day. And so I looked up and I said, "Oh, team, look at that deer." And everyone looked back at me and said, "That is a panther." So I joke that officially I've seen one, though I can't say I could actually make it out. But through the course of the Path of the Panther project, I've also had the opportunity to see firsthand a lot of wild panthers in rather sad situations, whether that be related to the neurological disorders the population's currently facing. Current leading cause of death of the Florida panther is vehicle mortality. On any given year, we lose about 20 to 30 individuals. And my first month working on this project, I will never forget, we went to the release of a female panther, FP224, who had been in a vehicle collision outside of Naples. And the great conservation heroes at FWC rescued her as well as her two cubs, who were later found hiding in nearby woods, rehabilitated them and released her into the wild. She is still successfully living on the outskirts of Naples, Florida. Unfortunately, her two kittens both lost their lives within a year following their release from a similar fate. And that story has provided a lot of inspiration to me so far as the resilience of the species, but also the fragility of their recovery.
That's really interesting. I actually had an encounter with a cougar this past winter where I was called into the Fish and Game office, and it was a cougar that I had been tracking. I'd never actually spotted. I hadn't put eyes on it. And it was dead in the back of a truck. It had been hit on a kind of secondary highway here in Canada. So connectivity is actually a really big issue here. And I suspect in Florida, it's an even bigger issue. Like, how important are your wildlife corridors, and how's Path of the Panther working to help protect them?
You know, here in South Florida, I like to say that we have a Western scale conservation opportunity hidden in the east. We have 4 million contiguous acres of public lands in Southwest Florida. But as I mentioned earlier, the development pressure continues. On any given year, we're losing an average of 12 to 20 acres an hour to suburban development, things that look relatively familiar to us as human beings. It's subdivisions and it's shopping centers. But what we're losing is primarily working lands. It's cattle ranches and citrus groves that provide vital, really green infrastructure for our state. And, you know, a species like a panther can utilize a cattle ranch to move between a national preserve and a state park, where they can't necessarily make that move across a subdivision. And it's been incredible to see really such a wide community coming together here in Florida to help ensure these species can get from one place to another. John, I have a question for you. You just shared this incredible story with us about tracking pumas. What is the major difference you've found working with pumas, bears, and wolves?
They're all the apex predators here in Canada. We're lucky in the Pacific Northwest, from Wyoming, Montana, Alberta, British Columbia, and the Yukon to have all of the big predators still intact. So grizzly bears, wolves, cougars, wolverines, lynx, etc. And I find there is quite a difference between them. Grizzly bears, for instance, at this time of year are quite easy to find. Literally just drive along any of the major highways or roadways, and they're feeding down in the valley bottoms right now. And it's quite easy to spend a couple mornings and go out and find a grizzly bear right now. Wolves and cougars, on the other hand, are much more difficult to find. Wolves, sometimes I have to spend a month, 2 months, 3 months to even get one good encounter. I'm going out every single day. And then cougars, it even gets to another level where I have to literally be out from dawn to dusk, like I was mentioning this past winter, tracking relentlessly. And even then, I might not have any success. I've gone entire winters before where I never see a cougar, even though I'm out 60, 70, 80 days trying to track them down. So there is definitely a different level of ease in finding each predator and then in being able to photograph them. One thing that stuck with me when you're talking about the connectivity and stuff is you mentioned ranches. And I remember reading some stuff about what you've done online. And I think in Path of the Panther, aren't some of your conservation heroes sort of very unlikely ones? It is some of the ranchers and the fishermen and people like that. Can you tell us a little bit about that side of the story?
John, one of the greatest parts of my job is that I get to work with really unlikely conservation heroes. The farmers, fishermen, and ranchers of the Florida Wildlife Corridor are the true guardians of our biodiversity and natural environment here in the state of Florida. And it's been remarkable to see the pride that they take in protecting these natural areas and ensuring that they stay green into perpetuity. So cattle rancher I was recently with, Alton Langford. He's, I believe, a 13th generation Floridian. He traces his ancestry back to the first arrival of cattle here in the Americas with Ponce de Leon 500 years ago. And Alton was explaining to me that he sees the American cowboy, but particularly Florida's cowboy, as an endangered species like the Florida Panther. As we're losing critical lands to development, with it is also going a way of life and a culture that sustains our economy. And so he's been really incredibly enthusiastic and passionate about the return of the Florida Panther, which gives me a remarkable amount of hope. As do cattle ranchers like Carrie Lightsey in the headwaters of the Greater Everglades ecosystem, who've conserved the vast majority of their lands under conservation easement, ensuring that for his family, I believe they currently have 3 generations working the land. Their heritage will continue, but that vital role and function they're playing in the watershed will continue as well.
That's really cool that it has led to these unlikely heroes being involved in conservation. I don't think we've quite got to that point yet in the Pacific Northwest, Canadian Rockies, even down into the northwestern states. I think a lot of times it's the ranchers and their ilk that are still the villains when it comes to things like wolves, and not all of them, of course. There are ones that are getting really heavily into conservation, but there is also still that big push to eradicate predators in much of our area up here, and we really see it here in Alberta. That's kind of why I co-founded the Exposed Wildlife Conservancy, because we really felt that the predators up here needed a voice. They're managed. I'll give you an example. Wolves, for instance, are able to be hunted in this part of Canada from September 1st until June 15th. So you can actually have a pregnant female wolf that can be shot, she can be trapped, she can be baited. On private land, in fact, they can shoot them year-round. So there's really almost no laws. It's a lawless state of wildlife management. And it's something that I think Exposed is really working to try and change here. We've come to realize through some of the recent science and studies out there, the research, that our big apex predators are actually critical to biodiversity. And we've also come to realize just how important this biodiversity is. There in Florida, you know now that the puma is right at that top of the food chain and is so critical. You protect that puma, you protect everything below it, and you protect that entire ecosystem. And that's something we're still developing up here in the Northwest. And hopefully we don't have to get to that state where, you know, we're left with 30 pumas and we have to start recovering them. Hopefully we can figure everything out up here before we get to that, you know, that sort of critical level of things being endangered.
Absolutely. I think you hit on such a really essential point that our predators are the canaries in the coal mine for entire ecosystems, but also our own species. If we lose the lands and the waters that they need to survive, we fundamentally lose what we as people need to survive as well. So I have to ask, in light of the challenges facing the Canadian Rockies, what gives you hope for the future of Canada's wildlife, or for that matter, our planet as a whole at this moment?
I think there's a couple of things that give me hope. Number one is we have made huge strides in connectivity up here. We now need to, you know, so if, for instance, we've got wildlife overpasses that go over our freeways and our interstates, which are called interprovincial highways up here. So we've got these huge, vast overpasses and underpasses that are now being used by everything from wolverines to cougars. So they've been a tremendous success. We now need to work on the habitat protection side of things because we're starting to realize that we haven't protected enough wilderness up here. And places like our national parks are actually becoming islands of wilderness now, surrounded by civilization. Whereas when they were first created, they were sort of these islands of almost development within the wilderness. And now it's flipped the script and it's the total opposite.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's impossible to be in this business without being an optimist.
Yeah, it is. And I guess the other thing that really gets me inspired and thinking that we are moving towards change is just how many people are starting to get into conservation. You know, it's not just you and me. I see so many young people now starting to come up and get involved right away, early in their careers. You know, it used to be in the past, for instance, that biologists would just stick to the science and the data, and they would never get involved as advocates. And I'm really seeing that start to change. And they're the ones that should be at the forefront advocating for change, because they're the ones that are getting that data and seeing right away, oh, geez, we're in trouble. You know, this species is in trouble, this habitat, this ecosystem is in trouble. So I'm really inspired by that. And it makes me think that we are starting to turn a corner, and that we will start to realize just what a huge issue the loss of biodiversity is, climate change, all these sorts of monster issues that if we just think about them on their own can kind of be overwhelming. But I think we are starting to make some progress on that.
I think that's such an important point you just hit on, that we're definitely at an all hands on deck moment. And your work as a conservation photographer and storyteller really links that data and that science with the hearts and minds of the public.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's something that actually I get asked quite a bit. How do I get more into conservation from people of all stripes and colors and so on? And it's really quite easy right now, because all you have to do is donate your skills, whether it's time, whether it's your social media prowess, whether it's your money. If that's what you have a lot of, that's something that you can donate. Your skills as a biologist, as a photographer, in your case, as a director, you know, you organize this entire project that is so critical to the Florida Panther. And we need people like you, and we need people coming up below that will move into this same, you know, we're going to need managing directors for projects all over the place. And we're starting to see that grow more and more as people get more into conservation. And I just think, I think there's so much people can do, even if they don't feel like they have any skills. Time is a skill. If you can put in time and volunteer with a conservation organization, with a nonprofit like mine, with Path of the Panther like yours, I think people can do so much to help change how we're going about moving around in this world towards a new future.
People are more passionate than ever about protecting our natural environment and in the fight against a changing climate. I think it's easy to, frankly, open Instagram and see these incredibly adventurous photos and think, what part do I have to play in this movement if I don't want to be wading chest deep through a swamp? And it turns out quite a bit. We need all skill sets. We need all perspectives. We need all hands on deck. And it is a go for it, all in, stick with it moment in time. The other thing I will add to that end is that I think it's really easy to look at the conservation movement as a whole and think that you need to go halfway across the world to get involved. I know I, for one, did. If you'd asked me a decade ago, the most imperiled corners of our planet, I would have said the Amazonian rainforest or the Okavango Delta or something of the sort. And on the contrary, it really starts in our own backyard. It's remarkable how much you can do at a local level, whether it be in your own garden planting natives or writing a city or county commissioner, or even up to the federal level, letting your policymakers know that you're paying attention and that you want to see change and action for our natural environment matters a lot.
Tori, you've actually had some really interesting success with policy, which is kind of the top level. That's where you have to get to actually have change implemented. Can you tell us a bit about what that was? What happened? What policy changes have you affected?
Right. So we had the remarkable opportunity to put the story of the Florida Panther to use in our state capital this legislative session, and managed to pass the Florida Wildlife Corridor Act with bipartisan unanimous support. The state also committed an additional $300 million to habitat protection across the corridor, which was a great achievement. Only the beginning of what needs to happen here, and we're excited for this journey to continue. But I have to tell you, it has given me so much hope and optimism for the future of our state and our wildlands, but also wildlife corridors across this country. New Hampshire, New Mexico, Oregon, Virginia, Colorado, they've all passed wildlife corridor legislation and resolutions. And obviously, as you spoke to earlier, there's incredible progress being made with transboundary parks or wildlife overpasses, and where I really see a remarkable opportunity for the conservation movement as a whole. Wildlife corridors provide an incredible opportunity for us to reach the ambitious goal of protecting 30% of our planet by 2030. To backtrack a little bit, I will also add, the legislative success that we just had here in Florida really was an overnight success, a decade in the making, I like to say, and it came thanks to the hard work of hundreds of people, scientists, of storytellers, of map makers, of farmers and ranchers and fishermen, and a whole lot of others in between. And it's exceptional to see all of those pieces come together. And to the point we were making earlier, a really great reminder that each and every one of us has a role to play in the movement to protect our natural world.
I don't think I could have said it any better. We really do have a role to play, every single one of us. And I hope people watching this take that to heart and get involved in any way that they possibly can in helping us with this fight to protect biodiversity and change this climate crisis for the better.
I agree entirely. Well, John, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. I hope to get up to Canada to pay you a visit at some point. This talk of easily accessible grizzly bears has sparked some curiosity on my end.
Sounds good. My door is open. I hope I get a chance to come down there and check out your project too there in Florida. Thank you, Tori.
Thank you, John. Bye.
Bye.